The story of Mary Neely. In the dangerous first years of the Cumberland settlements, the settlers at Manskers Station lived in constant uncertainty. Salt was desperately needed for preserving meat, and during the summer, a group from the station traveled to Neely's Lick to boil salt from the springs there. Among them was 16-year-old Mary Neely, the fourth of 10 children born to William and Margaret Neely. The settlers pitched camp near the Lick, about 2.5 miles from the fort. No Indian signs had been seen for some time, and the danger seemed distant. One evening, shortly before sunset, William Neely sent the other men back to the station while he and Mary remained behind alone at camp. As soon as the men disappeared from sight, 3 Indians emerged from the woods. Seeing William's gun lying a short distance away, they rushed upon him and split his head with tomahawks before he could defend himself. Mary fainted. When consciousness returned, 2 Indians were dragging her toward a canoe concealed in the cane along the riverbank.
That night, the settlers found William Neely dead and scalped. He made the first trip with Robertson. Men from Manskers Station followed the trail the next morning and discovered evidence that Mary was still alive. Yet Caspar Mansker warned against pursuit, fearing the Indians would kill her if pressed too closely.
Mary's captors traveled north for 3 days before joining the main body of their band. There, the Indians held counsel over her fate. She expected death, but instead they offered her a choice: become the wife of the warrior who had killed her father, or serve as a servant to the chief. Mary chose servitude. Bound at night with her hands crossed before her, she endured a long and terrible march northward. Whenever the Indians were not watching, she secretly cut marks into trees so pursuers might follow her trail, or so she might someday find her own way home. For 3 weeks, however, she could not even weep. At one point, overcome with grief, she finally began to cry. One of the warriors asked why. Mary answered simply, "You killed my father." The Indian replied that had he known it was her father, he would not have killed him.
The band eventually reached the region around Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. There, the Indians became less watchful, and Mary's skill with sewing made her useful enough to spare her life. She carried needles and mended clothing and garments for the women of the camp. More than once, she overheard discussions about killing and scalping her rather than burdening the band with a prisoner. The hardships were relentless. At times, the party had nothing to eat for 10 days except white oak bark. Once, starving nearly to death, Mary cut raw fat from a freshly killed bear and devoured it so ravenously it nearly killed her. Another time, the band survived by dividing a single quail into 14 portions. On another occasion, they ate a black snake. The Indians lived in constant fear of white settlers. Their chief ordered absolute silence in camp, forbidding even the smallest noise.
As the band moved north along the Wabash River into present-day Indiana, winter descended upon them. One night, Mary lay wrapped in her blanket while snow fell heavily around her. By morning, more than a foot covered the ground. The Indians searched for her unsuccessfully after she became buried beneath the snow until one accidentally struck her with a pole and awakened her, to the astonishment and delight of the party. Soon afterward, smallpox swept through the camp. Mary became horribly ill. Her body swelled and erupted in sores until she could only crawl on hands and knees. Blind for 4 days, nearly naked except for a blanket and cotton garment, she survived on bear oil while the camp suffered famine. A compassionate Indian woman treated her wounds with an ointment made from prickly pear simmered in bear grease and sheltered her alone in a small lodge near a spring. Eventually, after months of captivity, Mary escaped. After struggling through snow and exhaustion, abandoned by companions who could no longer travel, she reached a lonely cabin where a poor frontier woman nursed her back to health, using herbal remedies Mary herself had learned from the Indians. From there, Mary journeyed eastward with a family driving livestock. At the Susquehanna River, she demonstrated extraordinary courage and strength, by seizing an unruly cow by the nose and horn and leading it across the river herself after no one else could control it. Meanwhile, back in Kentucky and Tennessee, her family believed her dead. Her betrothed transferred his affections elsewhere. Yet Mary's brother Samuel never abandoned hope. While traveling in Kentucky, he overheard strangers describing a young woman formerly held captive by Indians who had crossed the Susquehanna while controlling a runaway cow. When he learned the woman was left-handed, he became convinced it was Mary.
Samuel began a determined search across Kentucky and Virginia, stopping at cabins and farms, asking after any former Indian captive. Finally, he heard of a young woman living at the Spears household in Virginia.
When he arrived, Mary was away at church. Samuel waited silently inside the house. When Mary entered, she passed by him without recognition and tossed her bonnet and shawl onto the bed. At that instant, she suddenly recognized him. "My brother! My brother!" she cried, throwing herself into his arms. Mary later married George Spears in 1785. Having learned much from both frontier hardships and Indian medicine, she became known throughout Kentucky and Illinois for treating the sick. Her home became a refuge for the suffering, and she gained a reputation as a gifted healer who helped countless settlers when physicians could do little.
Years later, while living in Illinois, Mary became acquainted with a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, who often visited to hear her remarkable frontier stories. On one occasion, after Lincoln departed from her home, Mary remarked quietly,
"That is a very smart young man. I would not be surprised if he is President of the United States someday." Mary Neely Spears lived into old age, carrying within her one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the early American frontier.